Encourage you to get your Bible and turn to the book of Daniel. We have been working our way through this great prophet. This is the last of the studies of Daniel, and we have for some time, even before this pandemic hit, we were working our way through some of the, not some, but all of the major prophets, and this is the last of that, so this is the finishing of all of that hurried look through the prophets. I say it's hurried because I'm trying to put together a study book on the prophets, and it's supposed to cover this in about 15 lessons, all of the major prophets. So that's kind of a hurried look. But be that as it may, we're ready to look at Daniel chapter 9 through 12. The most difficult section of this book, and in my mind, the most difficult section of the major prophets. There's some things in the minor prophets, for example, Zechariah, that's equally as difficult or about as difficult, but this is a very difficult section. Here is our outline that we've been following of the book of Daniel. Chapters 1 through 6 is the history section. Everybody's really familiar with that section. That's the easier section of the book. And then the vision section that we started last time, or got into last time, in chapters 7 through 12. We are all familiar with those three things of Daniel in the lion's den and the fiery furnace. Some of the visions of, for example, Nebuchadnezzar's vision in chapter 2. But when we get into chapter 7, we have the vision section. In this section, like we had with reference to the history section, it's divided into two periods of time. He focuses on the visions under the Babylonian rule, chapters 7 and 8. We've already looked at that. And now we're ready for under the Medo-Persian rule of chapters 9 through 12. Two things happen here. We have the prophecy of 70 weeks. That's not all that happens in chapter 9, but that is one of the predominant things in chapter 9. And then 10 through 12 is the vision of the time of the end. Not the end of time, the time of the end. We'll make that distinction a little bit later. So let's look at chapters 9 through 12. Chapter 9 is called simply, or we call it the vision of 70 weeks. Let's see what this is about. But before we get to the 70 weeks, verses 1 through 9 will be the simplest of all that we're going to consider tonight. And so let's look at verses 1 to 19, Daniel's prayer for people. So what we have in verses 1 and 2 concerning Daniel's prayer, Daniel had understood from Jeremiah's prophecy that the captivity would end in 70 years. We're not going to read every verse. We don't have time for that in this pace of a study. But look at verse 2, that Daniel understood by the books the numbers of the years specified by the word of the Lord given through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolation of Jerusalem. Well, that's what Jeremiah had said. And Jeremiah had said that in 70 years they'd come back. Jeremiah chapter 25. And by the way, Cyrus, the leader, had read that, and he was specified as the one that after 70 years it would release him, and that's why he let him go. But be that as it may, look at verse 2, and you might underline the 70 years because a play is going to be made off of that, and it's a launching point for another thing to be said later in the chapter. But Daniel had understood that. And so Daniel then launches into a prayer, verses 3 to 15. So what's his prayer about? Well, the first thing he does in prayer is the confession of sins. And this is on behalf of the nation. This is not Daniel just personally, that he's acknowledging all of his sins, and he's focusing on Daniel, but he's praying on behalf of the nation, and it was the sin of the nation that took them into captivity to start with. And so again, we won't read every verse, but notice beginning at verse 5, or verse 4 rather, that he made confession. He said, I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession. And he cries out to God. And look at verse 5. We have sinned and committed iniquity and have done wickedly and rebelled. We're just going to look at several of the phrases that describe the sin they committed. Verse 6, neither have we heeded your servants the prophets. So we didn't pay attention to the prophets. We didn't heed their words. They came in, they warned us, and we ignored the prophets, talking about the nation as a whole. Verse 7, he said, that, O Lord, righteousness belongs to you, but shame of face to us. So we should be ashamed, and we are ashamed of what we have done. Again at verse 8, there's shame of face to us. Verse 9, we have rebelled against God. Verse 11, verse 11, we have transgressed your law. Now then at verse 12, he points out that all of the captivity and the punishment that God had brought upon Israel was justified because indeed they had violated the law of God. And so notice at verse 12, he said that he has confirmed his word, which he's spoken against us and against our judges, and judged us to bring upon us great disaster. For under the whole heaven such never has been done as was done to Jerusalem, such as the destruction of Jerusalem in the third invasion of Nebuchadnezzar. So nothing has been done like this before, in that complete and utter destruction, and it was justified because of our sins. Now at verses 16 to 19, the plea on behalf of the people was, please turn away your wrath. Look at verse 16. According to your righteousness, I pray, let your anger and your fury be turned away from your city, Jerusalem. So this is at the end, as Babylon has fallen, and Daniel understood from the prophecy 70 years is going to bring it to an end. So he now knows that the captivity is ending because we're in this Medo-Persian period. Consequently, he said, let your fury and your wrath be lifted from Jerusalem. Now look at verse 18. It's not because of our righteous deeds, but because of your great mercies. In other words, we're not pleading with you to lift your wrath from us because we're so great and because we've done so well, but because of your mercy, we ask that you do that. Now, that's the simplest of all we're going to consider tonight, and so we're going to move into a little harder sections now. Now we have, beginning at verse 20, the vision of 70 weeks. The vision of 70 weeks. It has been greatly perverted by the premillennialists and many others. But this is a little simpler than when we chapter 11. Chapter 11 is the most difficult of all, but let's see what happens here. Beginning at verse 20 now, Gabriel comes to explain. So let's look at verse 20 to 23. He said, I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of the people. That he said, as I was speaking, verse 21, a man Gabriel, whom I had seen in a vision before, and I'm paraphrasing, that he informed me, and he said to me, O Daniel, verse 22, that I have come now forth to give you skill and understanding. At the beginning of your supplication, what's he talking about? When he started this prayer back in chapter 9, verse 1. At the beginning of that, the word was sent out, and therefore consider the matter and understand the vision. So here is the vision of the 70 weeks. Now, we have to follow this or we'll get lost with reference to the vision. Now, in verses 27, so that's just a few verses, he gives the details of the 70 weeks. So what are those details? Well, that's what this little chart and graph is about. There's a total of 70 weeks. That seems to be launched from verse 2 in a playoff of the 70 years. That 70 years that this captivity was going to be fulfilled. And the 70 weeks is not a literal 70 weeks, that is 70 periods of 7 days each. That's not the idea of the 70 here, but in apocalyptic literature, which this fits, the number 7 is the idea of completion, and so it's multiples of 7 is the idea of completion. It's symbolic and not literal, and that's if we want to make it literal, then it's not going to work out with reference to the things that are identified. For example, from the time of the decree until the destruction of Jerusalem was far more than 70 weeks, literal 70 weeks. So it's launched from this concept of the 70 years. Now, verse 24, 70 weeks are determined. So that's the length of the time. What's going to happen? Well, verse 24, for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression and to make an end, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. You say, well, I'm already lost. Well, it's pointing to the time of the Messiah. And what he's saying is that the 70 weeks is pointing to the time of the Messiah and the end of the Jewish nation. And we're going to see more about the end of the Jewish nation in just a moment. The nation is coming back. It's going to be rebuilt, coming out of captivity. But there's going to be an end to the Jewish nation ultimately in the future. So it's going to be the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 ultimately. Now, he says at verse 25, now we're going to put all this together. Let's get the details, and then we'll assemble all the parts that we throw out before us. So let's just picture us pulling a bunch of stuff out of a box and looking at all the parts. We're going to lay them out, and then we're going to assemble it here in just a moment. So we've got one part there at verse 24. Now, at verse 25, this seems to have reference to the decree of Cyrus to go forth and go back and rebuild the city. That is, as Babylon fell. It says that from the going forth of the command, that seems to be the decree of Cyrus, to restore and build Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Now, whatever number of weeks we're going to come up with, it's going to end up being 70. You can see on the screen we've got 7 and 62 that's going to be mentioned in a moment. That makes 69, and you add 1, that makes the 70. All right, let's go further. And there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And the street shall be built again, even in troublesome times. So there's something about the time of the decree being to rebuild. There's something about the coming of the Messiah, the Christ coming to earth, coming on earth, and his birth and his advent and living on earth. And then there's something pointing to the rebuilding of the city, and it's going to be done in difficult times. Now let's go further. Verse 26. And after 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off. That is, the Messiah is going to be killed. And he's going to be cut off, but not for himself. Now that's obviously a prophecy. He's going to be cut off or die, but it's not on his behalf that he dies. It's on the behalf of others. And the people of the prince who come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. That is, the Romans, that we'll identify later in chapter 12, are going to destroy Rome. Going to destroy Jerusalem. So that's pointing to the destruction of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Drop down to verse 27. He shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, that it's at the end. And in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to the sacrifice and offering. Now, at verse 27, and the wing of the abomination shall be one who makes desolate. That's the abomination of desolation that Jesus quotes in Matthew 24 and in Luke 21, until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Now, how do I know that's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem at the end down here? Because Jesus quotes from Daniel 9 and applies it to the destruction of Jerusalem. So we have divine interpretation in Matthew 24 and Luke 21 that the abomination of desolation refers to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. We know that. So that's a beginning point for us. We know there was a decree that was given to rebuild, that Daniel lived in that time, and so it's going to be 7 weeks. And so let's go back now and get the 7 weeks. There shall be to restore, I'm reading at verse 25, and build Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince, till the coming of the Messiah, shall be 7 weeks. So from the time to rebuild Jerusalem, back here, the decree, to the coming of the Messiah shall be 7 weeks. Now again, that's not literal. He's just saying there's going to be a period of time until the Messiah comes, to the coming of the Messiah. Then there's going to be 62 weeks, he said. And after 62 weeks, the Messiah would be cut off. So the Messiah is going to be cut off, and the sacrifices are going to cease. That is, there's going to come an end to the sacrifices. And there's, not listed on the screen, there's the new covenant mentioned at verse 27 that's going to come during that time. And 1 week, there's going to be the destruction of Jerusalem. So what is the point of the vision of 70 weeks? That when 70 weeks are finished, God is finished with the Jewish commonwealth. Now get the picture, the overall picture, rather than focusing on exactly how does 62 relate to 7 and to 1. That all adds up to 70, and I know it's 70 because he said after 70 weeks. So this is not a literal time, but what he's saying is that from the time of going back, they've come out of captivity for 70 years. Daniel sees a vision that after 70 weeks, again not literal, there's going to be an end to the Jewish commonwealth. They're going to be rebuilding now, and out of this rebuilding is going to come the Messiah. He'll ultimately be cut off, but then there's going to come an end to the Jewish nation. And that's the point of the vision. Now, what am I learning from that? I'm seeing more this time in our study of Daniel, and hopefully you are too, more than ever before, this principle, God rules in the kingdoms of men. Normally when we study Daniel, we point out those several verses that mention God rules in the kingdom of men. But this is one of the sections that makes that point without that wording, that God rules in the kingdom of men. God bringing this nation back, he's going to ultimately destroy this nation. God rules in the kingdom of men, and he'll bring an end to this nation ultimately before it's all over. Now, let's go to the vision of the time of the end, not the end of time. This is not talking about the end of time, the final judgment, but the time of the end. An appointed time of God is all that expression refers to. What's going to go on here? This is the most difficult section of all, particularly chapter 11, and I'll tell you why when we get to chapter 11. Daniel sees a vision of a man in linen. So we're going to hit the high points. We're not going to to camp on each individual verse in this section, so don't get excited. We're not going to camp and get completely lost. But here we have in chapter 10 now, Daniel sees a vision of a man in linen, and a messenger brings comfort. First of all, let's talk about this messenger coming, or a man in linen, clothed in linen, in verses 1 to 9. Daniel receives a vision, and he's disturbed. That he said he saw this man dressed in linen. He was clothed in linen, verse 5, and gives other details of a picture of one dressed for judgment, it seems. You can read for yourself the description at verse 6, which seems to be a messenger of judgment. But be that as it may, he sees a man dressed in linen, and he says at verses 1 to 3, though, he said he receives a vision, and he's troubled about this vision. He couldn't sleep. In those days, he said, I mourned for full 3 weeks and ate no pleasant food, and for 3 weeks until they were fulfilled. So he said, I got a vision, and I was disturbed about that. Well, now, what about the vision? Now, this is where the man with linen comes in. Here is the vision in verses 4 to 6. There was a man dressed in linen, and he came to me, and he said his body was like beryl, and his face was like the appearance of lightning, and his eyes were like torches of fire, and his arms were like burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the voice of a multitude. I saw all of that. Now then, beginning at verse 7, here was his reaction to this vision of seeing this man. He said that he was greatly again disturbed about that. Look at verse 7, that he said, I saw it, but the others around me didn't see that. And I was left alone, and I saw this great vision. I'm at verse 8, and no strength remained in me, and my vigor turned to frailty, and I retained no strength. In other words, he lost all strength, and he's disturbed about what he saw. And so now we're ready for verse 10. A messenger brings comfort to Daniel. Verses 10 to 21. Now what he says in verses 10 to 21, he said he touched me and made me tremble on my knees. So he said, a messenger come and he touched me. Now, I'm disturbed about what I saw. What's this all about? I'm greatly disturbed about that. And he said to me, verse 12, do not fear, Daniel. Don't fear. Don't be afraid. Here's the key. We're going to come back to verse 13. I'm here to make you understand that what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision refers to many days yet to come. So Daniel, what you've seen refers to things that are yet to come, many days yet to come. Your vision, which actually doesn't end at chapter 10, it goes on into 11 and 12, is something that's going to happen for many days yet to come. So that's what your vision is about. Don't get all upset, Daniel, right yet, because it has to do with the future and even distant future from your day, Daniel. But let's go back to verse 13. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me. That's what this messenger said. 21 days, and behold, Michael, who is an archangel, one of the chief princes. So the term prince seems to be used in the sense of an angel here. Some think that this has reference to the angel of the Medes, based on chapter 11 and verse 1. And we'll come back to that concept. Put that in the back of your head. Now, I want you to notice beginning at verse 15 to 21, and we're going to close out chapter 10 now by making this point. Verse 18, he said, then again, the one having the likeness of a man touched me, and he strengthened me. So Daniel was strengthened by the presence of one who came to him. And again, he was told, do not fear, verse 19. And he said he was strengthened by that. So Daniel's vigor came back to him, and strengthened. But what did he learn from this? Then he said, verse 20, do you know why I have come to you? I must return to fight with the prince of Persia. When I have gone forth, indeed, the prince of Greece will come. Now, that's our introduction to Greece here in this vision. So you say, well, I'm lost. What's he talking about? Well, it seems back in verse 13, the prince, and by mentioning Michael as a prince, the term prince is used in the sense of an angel. And some suggest, and this would harmonize with the principle we see in the book of Revelation, that behind the war going on earth, behind the battle between right and wrong on earth, there is a battle in heaven with angelic beings. And here seems to be the angel of the Medes fighting with the angel of Greece. And the point may be that the angel forces are involved in the rise and the fall of nations. that there is a greater battle going on than just the battle between this king, or this nation and this nation. Behind that is a battle where angels somehow, how they're involved I don't know, but angels somehow involved in the rise and the fall of nations. And so that may be the case. So the point of it, at verse 20 and 21, verse 20 rather, Paul points to the fall of the Medo-Persian Empire to Greece. But that ought to be of some comfort to Daniel. How so? Well, Babylon has just fallen. It was because of Babylon rising in power that Judah fell. And that lasted for 70 years. Now the Medo-Persians are in power. And now with the Medo-Persians in power, and Greece is not even on the scene at the moment, here is a prophecy. Greece is going to rise up, meaning that the Medo-Persian Empire will finally collapse. It reminds Daniel God rules in the kingdoms of men. We're seeing that in nearly every chapter. This is the lesson we need for our present day. We need it for all days. But God rules in the kingdom of men. God is in control. And so God sees down the line, and he sees that Greece is coming. So now let's go to chapter 11. This is the most difficult of all. At the beginning of our study of Daniel, we pointed out that the latter section, chapters 7 through 12, will challenge the best of Bible students. And this certainly is challenging. This is the most challenging section of the prophets I've dealt with. And so I put a footnote here. I reserve the right. You may hear me teach in the future on Daniel 11, and I may teach it differently. And I may have a different interpretation on that because there's some difficulty involved. And let's just work through and see what that is. This seems to talk about the period of Greek and Roman Empire. So it seems because we all agree that it deals with the Greek Empire. The question is whether it deals with the Roman Empire toward the end. That's the question, the big difficulty. We'll get to that in a moment. So here's what I'm seeing in verses 1 to 4. By the way, let me footnote here that our interpretation of chapters 9 through 12, particularly 10 through 12, are going to harmonize with the picture we saw in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 and also Daniel 8 in part. Because what we saw was the rise of 4 world empires and the collapse of 4 world empires. And we saw that again in Daniel 7. And we see that seemingly again here in this section of Daniel. It seems to harmonize. So what I see in verses 1 to 4 is a principle we've already noted in Daniel. And that is, here's the rise of the Greek Empire. How do we know we're talking about the Greek Empire? Well, they just introduced them in verse 20 of the previous chapter. So verses 1, or verse 2, talks about the Medes at verse 1. Verse 2, and now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and a 4th will be far richer than them all. Perhaps talking about Xerxes, or Artaxerxes, or Ahasuerus rather, Xerxes. And though his riches he shall stir up against all the realm of Greece. Now here's where the Greek Empire comes to play. Then a mighty king shall arise, probably talking about Alexander the Great, the first great ruler that we've already talked about. Remember the ram with the one horn? That he shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. In other words, pretty much do what he wants. He conquered the world by age 33. But now at verse 4, after he is arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided into the 4 winds. Remember the 4 kingdoms that are going to be divided up. It doesn't mean the Greek Empire is ending at that point. What it means is that no ruler of a realm or a region had the power that Alexander the Great had. And so here the divided region. There's going to be Syria, there's going to be Macedonia, and the Seleucids, and Thrace, and Egypt, going to be divided into 4 directions. Well, that's exactly what happened to the Greek Empire. Now, beginning at verse 5, there is going to be conflict within the empire. And so, lest we get lost, I'm just going to summarize this section quickly, and you can circle some verses that deal with that. There's going to be a conflict between Egypt to the south and Syria to the north. That was part of the empire. And so, Egypt and Syria are going to battle things out. For a while, Syria is going to prevail over Egypt, verses 5 and 6. And then Egypt will prevail over Syria, verses 7 and 8. And then Syria is going to make an unsuccessful attack, verses 9. They're going to come back. And then Egypt boasting, they seem to boast because they are prevailing over Syria, and Syria had this unsuccessful attack. Egypt's going to boast for just a little while. It's not going to last because Syria is coming back with more power and more strength when they're coming back. So what are we seeing in verses 5 to 19? There's conflict within within the Greek Empire. This chapter, I believe it was Haley who observed, that this chapter has more detailed prophecy than any single prophecy in the entire prophecies of the Old Testament. The details of what's going to happen. This king's going to follow by this king, by this king, by this king, and here's what's going to take place. Well, we don't have time to deal with every detail of that, but that's the gist of this struggle within the empire. All right, now at that point this prophecy is being uttered, the Greek Empire has not even risen yet, but it's going to rise. Let's say we see the same thing in chapter 2 and chapter 7 and chapter 8. Now we've talked about Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a Syrian ruler. And 20 to 35, everyone pretty much agrees, this deals with Antiochus Epiphanes. So our difficulty hasn't come to play just yet. So let's see what happens in this section. There's going to be one arise within this empire. This seems to everyone that thinks it refers to Antiochus Epiphanes, who ruled in Syria from 175 to 164 BC. He's pictured at verse 21 as a vile person, and indeed he was. He's going to plunder Jerusalem, verses 22 to 24. He's going to come in and plunder Jerusalem, and he did that. Remember, he defiled the sanctuary, and we talked about that in our last study. And Syria is going to prevail over Egypt, verses 25 to 28. And so this is, again, part of that prophecy. What's going to Syria is going to prevail under his leadership over that. He will defile the sanctuary. Look at verse 29. This well fits what happened with Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 29, at the appointed time he shall return, and he shall defile the sanctuary. Verse 31, and then he shall take away the daily sacrifices. So he's going to defile the sanctuary, as we talked about last time, burning swine upon the altar, encouraging his soldiers, for example, to commit fornication within the temple. He's going to come and do all of that, so he defiles the sanctuary. So this is that vile ruler that's going to rise. Now then, here's where we get to our difficulty. Let's back up, though, just for a moment and comment on verse 27. But both the king's heart shall be bent on evil for the end. I'm reading now, I'm dropping to the end of the verse. For the end will still be at the appointed time. That's that principle, God ruling and God controlling all things. And that is, God is in control, and they're on a divine timetable. Antiochus Epiphanes doesn't decide how long his kingdom lasts. God will decide that. And God's going to decide how long this nation will last. It's not up to what we do November 3rd or whatever day our election is. That's not what we're going to decide the future of our nation. God's going to decide the future of this nation. And God will take it down. God will keep it going. God will raise up leaders to keep us going, or God will bring them down. Everything's on God's timetable is the idea. Now, talk about Rome is going to rise in power. Verse 36, on a cursory reading, it almost seems as if there is no change in scenery. As if this were a play, you're still talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. And several think that we are still talking about Antiochus. Several very conservative, decent scholars think this is still talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. And it very well may be. And so if you think so, then have at it. I'm not sure I can argue against that. But those who tell us, Haley and others, argue that this is talking about the Roman Empire starting at verse 36. And there's been an abrupt change in scenery starting at verse 36. And why do we think perhaps that may refer to Rome? Well, Rome has already been introduced back at verse 30, because with Antiochus Epiphanes, the Romans, ships from Cyprus, are coming against him. So Rome is already beginning to battle against him. That's one reason. Secondly, the description of things that follow well fits with the Roman Empire. For example, claiming to be gods at verse 36, conquering Egypt, verse 43, and many suggest that verse 43 will not fit with Antiochus Epiphanes, but fits well with Egypt. And furthermore, it fits with the four-world empire picture that we saw in chapter 2 and in chapter 7. It's going to fit with that. And furthermore, it fits with the final scene of things, the final for the book of Daniel in chapter 12. Now, I'm not going to give all the reasons why it could be Antiochus Epiphanes, but there are some good arguments for that as well. And so it's almost also the coin, but I want to lean that it's perhaps Rome that he's talking about. So let's approach it from that vantage point. Now, coming out of the Greek Empire, what Daniel is seeing in this vision is that there's going to be another empire rise up after the Medo-Persian. You've seen Medo-Persia rise up, Daniel. There's going to be the Greek Empire, but it's going to fall because rise is going to come with reverence. So what will Rome do? Well, there's going to be blaspheming and claiming to be above every god. Well, that's exactly what the emperors did. There was emperor worship. And so they claimed to be God, and that would fit well with verse 36 to 39. There's the expanding of the empire. Well, obviously Antiochus Epiphanes expanded his, but here we have the expanding of the empire, and notice at verse 43, verse 42 rather, he shall stretch out his hand against the countries and the land of Egypt, and they shall not escape. In other words, he's expanding his empire. And so what we have here, I think, is a picture of Rome expanding the empire. But the chapter ends at verse 45 that Rome will finally fall. Rome is finally going to fall. So here again is the principle of God ruling in the kingdoms of men. Now notice at verse 45, and he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas, the Mediterranean Sea, and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. So if it's talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, he's going to fall, and he did. If it's talking about the Roman Empire, it's going to fall, and it did. So whatever it's talking about, it came to pass. But the point seems to be to Daniel, and Daniel is supposed to be seeing God's ruling in the kingdoms of men. God knows what's going to happen to these nations. God's not saying, you know, this kingdom could rise, and it might fall. God's saying, Rome is going to rise, and Rome's going to fall. God rules in the kingdoms of men. Now let's go to the last chapter now and make some sense. Only 13 verses here. This seems to focus during the Roman rule, and that has to be, if that's correct, that's because we're correct in our interpretation of verse 36 to 45. And so we're going to go with that at this moment. So during the Roman rule, verses 1 to 7 talks about there's going to be a time of trouble for the Jewish nation. And that's exactly what happened under the Roman rule. It was a time of trouble for the Jewish nation. So let's see what the great time of trouble, verses 1 to 4. At that time Michael shall stand up, and the great prince who stands, I'm reading at verse 1, and watch over the sons of your people. But there shall be a time of trouble. There's our identity of trouble. Such has never been since there was a nation. At the time your people shall be delivered, every one shall be found written in the book, and many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Now, some think the verse 2 is talking about the resurrection in the end of time, but the resurrection in the end of time, all are going to be raised. This is an idea of many being raised, not everybody being raised. What's he talking about? I think he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in this context. And let's go ahead and get down to verse 4, and we'll see some things about that. Those who are wise, I'm reading at verse 3, shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn away to righteousness like the stars forever and forever. But let's go back and notice at verse 1. There's going to be something that's a time of trouble like has never been before during this Roman period. Well, that well fits the idea of the destruction of Jerusalem that had been pointed to back in chapter 9 in the vision of the 70 weeks. There's going to be a time of trouble like has never been before. Well, Jesus had commented upon that in Matthew 24. There's going to be a suffering and a tribulation like has never been experienced before in AD 70. And what's the idea of there many would be raised? Well, coming out of that, there's going to be righteous people who are going to be spared. They're going to be wicked to go in further wickedness, but there's going to be some people who will turn to righteousness because of the devastation that they see in Jerusalem. Now, verse 4. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Again, not the end of time, but till the appointed time. That's the idea of the time of the end, till the appointed time. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Now, what is that all about? Well, it may be, I think he's probably talking about the end of the Jewish nation. Some think it may have reference to the end of Rome. That's, again, kind of a toss of the coin. I'm not sure. But I want to lean toward the fact that he's probably having reference to the end of the Jewish nation because he just talked about the Jewish nation being attacked and going to be devastated in verses 1 to 4. And so, Daniel, you're to seal up the book and until the time, until it's over. It could be either one of those, but it's probably the destruction of finally the Jewish nation. Now, There's going to be this time of trouble that Rome brings upon the Jewish nation for a limited time. Now, this is a powerful point made in Daniel, and it's made in the book of Revelation as well. Let's see about that in verses 5 to 7. And Daniel said, and looked, and there were two others on the river banks, and one said to the man clothed in linen, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? And then I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, who held his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever and ever, that it shall be for a time, and times, and a half a time. Now, we've seen that before, chapter 7 in verse 35. Will be for a time, or verse 25. A time, time, and a half a time. That's half of 7 because that's 3 and a half. So it's incomplete. And notice what else he says. And the holy people have been completely shattered, and these things shall be finished. What's the point? The point is Rome is there's going to be a time of trouble. Rome is going to bring trouble upon the Jewish people. But it's only going to be for a limited time. For a time, time, and a half a time. In other words, God's in control. God rules in the kingdoms of men. I'm impressed how many times that point's made without wording it that way, that God rules in the kingdom of men. And so, what do we learn from that? If I don't learn anything, this may help us. No matter where you are politically, if this election doesn't go the way you want it to go, you probably are going to, you may not say out loud, but you may say to your own self, this country is over and it's come to an end and we are in trouble. Well, whatever trouble we get in, it's for a time, time, and a half a time. Incomplete time. Not for 3.5 years, but it's the idea, it's a limited time because God's in control. It's only for a limited time that evil has power and evil has their reservation, has their sense of power. So now let's go beginning at verse 8 through verse 13 to finish the book and the chapter. Rome will fall and God's kingdom will prevail, verse 8 to 13. So what happens here? Well, he said, and I heard and did not understand, and I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these? In other words, what about Rome falling? When will it happen? And he said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed for the time of the end. That expression again, not the end of time, but the time of the end. The time, there's an appointed time for that. Many shall be purified, made white and refined. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. But that's interesting. That's not the end of the book. We have 3 more verses to go, but practically at the end of the book. For all practical purposes, we're at the end of the book. That the wicked are going to do wickedly, but the righteous or the wise shall understand. What do you mean shall understand? I think it's this principle that God's in control and God rules in the kingdoms of men. Again, let's make application to us. Things may happen in the future. Things may be happening now, and it may cause those who are wicked to turn to more wickedness. They're unwise. But the wise will know this principle. God's still in control. He's still on his throne, and God rules in the kingdom of men. He said the wise will understand that. Now then, we get even more difficult here. Let's finish out with some difficulty. Now, he said, and from that time, there shall be, from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. 1,290 days. From what? From point A to point B is going to be 1,290 days. What's point A to point B? From the time that the daily sacrifice was taken away, probably pointing to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes took the daily sacrifice away, to the abomination of desolation, which Jesus said referred to the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, obviously that's not literal, 1,290 days. Because there's a lot more than 1,290 days from the time of Antiochus Epiphanes to the destruction of Jerusalem. It's not literal. It's the idea of an indefinite time that God knows and God controls. This is the time of the end. It's an appointed time of God. That's the idea of the time of the end. And so it's 1,290 days. It's an indefinite period of time that God knows and God controls. Well, we're not through with the difficulty. And blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. In other words, 45 days after that would bring you to to 1335, he's pointing to the fall of Rome, because that was the question back at verse 8, is the fall of Rome. So if you got lost in that, let me see if I can catch you up. From the time, if I can get caught up, from the time of Antiochus Epiphanes bringing an end of the daily sacrifice to the destruction of Jerusalem is 1,290 days. From that time to the fall of Rome is another 45 days, which brings us to 1335. Again, those are not exact days. It's not a literal number. It's an indefinite period of time that God knows and God controls. So it ends on the note that fourth world empire that was seen in chapter 2 and in chapter 4, that fourth beast, is going to come to an end. And what you learn is this principle right here: God rules in the kingdom of men. I've been impressed with that for a long time, and I've been impressed with it from Daniel. I've never been as impressed with that as I have this time, even though it's a hurried look. How many times that's driven home without that phrase being used. I knew how many times the phrase was used. I'm impressed with how often that point is made. God's in control. God rules in the kingdoms of men. We see that God keeps his promise. If God says he's going to do something for his people, he will. If he's going to bring the Messiah in, he will. If he's going to bring an end to the Jewish nation, he will. If he says he's going to bring an end to Rome, he will. If God says he rules in the kingdoms of men, he will. But the thing I see at the end of chapter 12 is Daniel is a faithful man, and I'm learning that faithful will be victorious. But what's interesting to notice about the book of Daniel, starting in chapter 2, there was, back over here, was the growing out of this fourth world empire, or during that time, God's going to establish a kingdom that would never be destroyed. And so much of the rest of the book is about the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire and it falls. And then there's the Greek Empire and it falls. And then there's the Roman Empire and it falls. But not one word about the kingdom of God falling. But every encouragement, it'll be victorious and it will continue on. Well, hopefully you didn't get too lost in that. That is a difficult section. Very particularly chapter 11 is the most difficult of all for me. And hopefully you gain something from that. There may be one or more present, not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? Subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and while we sing?